Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today we'll be discussing the case of a woman who left for her lunch break one afternoon in late winter but never returned. The following day, her body was located in a neighboring state, making the job of identifying her all the more difficult. Once she was given her name back, authorities became incredibly tight-lipped about their investigation, and in turn, her case has not been discussed for decades. But now, over 23 years later, we think it's time for more information to be released, in hopes that the public might be able to provide aid in solving this mystery. Today's case is about the suspicious death of Mary Morales. Between 6:30 and 6:45 a.m. on Thursday, March 4th, 1999, the Vermont State Police were receiving numerous calls from drivers traveling northbound along Interstate 91 in Vernon, Vermont, and what those callers were stating they'd seen was cause for serious concern. The callers were all reporting that it looked as though a body had been left on the side of the road, and due to how close the woman was to the roadway, she was easy to spot. According to early reporting on this case, the woman was seen lying just past the guardrail with her arm resting up against it. Authorities were dispatched to the area and upon their arrival discovered that the calls that were coming in were legitimate, and there was in fact a deceased young woman lying on the side of the breakdown lane of the highway. As authorities reviewed the scene and the woman's body, they found that she was completely nude with no jewelry on. She had no identification on her whatsoever, and there was no indication that any of her belongings, clothing included, would be found nearby, at least based on a preliminary search of the area. And because of the lack of items with the woman, authorities had their work cut out for them to try and identify her. Now, at about 9 a.m., a little over 2 hours after she'd been discovered, the ME arrived to the scene and declared the woman deceased. 2 hours after that, by 11 a.m., the unidentified female's body was removed from the scene, and her autopsy was scheduled for the following day, Friday, March 5th. After the woman had been found, as I mentioned, investigators did not know who she was, and they were going to need the public's help to try and identify her. Her description was pushed out to several local newspapers in hopes that someone would recognize her features and characteristics and come forward. The female was described as roughly 5 feet 5 inches tall, approximately 98 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. She was also believed to be anywhere from 25 to 30 years old, and was said that she could have been of Mediterranean or Spanish descent. Also, according to reporting in the Brattleboro Reformer, quote, "The woman had a small scar on her left wrist and a tear in her right earlobe. The woman also showed signs of childbirth," end quote. For the next few days, there was additional coverage on the unidentified female found along I-91, and authorities were hoping that the right viewer would see the description and they'd be able to give her her name back. Meanwhile, investigators didn't let the fact that they still hadn't identified this woman stop them from beginning their search for her killer. Over the weekend, several leads were chased down, which of course did include attempts to identify her. But some leads had to do with the review of surveillance footage at a local business located on Canal Street, which was just under 5 miles or an 8-minute drive from where this body was found along I-91. I later discovered the Canal Street business was likely a Burger King location. And I believe the reason authorities were reviewing that footage goes back to the fact that the woman found was nude and no clothing had been found at the scene. Apparently, someone had reported that they found several pieces of women's clothing thrown into a dumpster at this Burger King location. Authorities seized those pieces of clothing and brought them into, at the very least, hold in evidence until they could confirm whether they belonged to this deceased woman or not. Along with that, investigators were also sending her fingerprints to the FBI for them to run through their fingerprint database, but it was mentioned that if she'd never been printed before, they might not be able to confirm her identity that way, and that turned out to be the case. Within the first couple of days, it was unclear if the woman left on the highway had been killed or if something else could have taken place. I mean, I personally believe if a deceased nude woman was left on the side of the road, homicide is likely the manner of death, but that might not always be the case. And that makes me want to mention this odd comment I found in a Brattleboro Reformer piece written prior to the completion of this woman's autopsy, or at least prior to when some of those findings were released. It states, quote, "Even if the death is determined to be natural or accidental, the person who left her body could be charged with transporting the body without a burial permit," end quote.
Odd.
Yes.
I've never heard of that before, but it sounds like something that you would actually need. It's like what you would have for like a funeral parlor as like a license to be able to go pick up the body after the medical examiner released it. You know,
and transport them to a funeral home.
Right,
like
you're
they did.
licensed to do that.
Yeah, I would assume so. But I just thought it was so weird. Like, would the police be putting that out publicly to say, oh, if this was you, come forward, you're not going to get charged with anything worse? Or
no,
like, I don't know. It's just such a weird thing to say.
Yeah, it's a weird thing to say. And I think it would be a poor move for the police department to be like, oh, come forward and tell us who you are and we won't charge you. It's like, you don't know who I am now. I'm not going to tell you and show you who I am.
Exactly. Very true.
But I think that would be more of like a charge that you could hold over someone's head once you found that they may have been involved or connected to this deceased female prior to her death.
That's a good point. Yep.
Hey, we can charge you with this. You better talk and tell us what you know.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Finally, though, by Monday, March 8th, 4 days after the woman was found on the side of I-91, it was released publicly that her autopsy had been completed, and it was confirmed that she was, in fact, the victim of a homicide. However, authorities were keeping her cause of death close to the chest. Now, at this point, it's about 3 or 4 days into the investigation, and authorities still didn't appear to be any closer to confirming the female's identity. So they took a bold step and provided a photo of the deceased woman's face as she lay in the morgue awaiting identification to local reporters for them to run in the paper. Investigators definitely felt as though, at least at this point, that it was a necessary step to release this photo in hopes that someone would recognize her, as it seemed as though all other avenues had been exhausted.
I'm almost taken aback by that they're going to put out a photo of a deceased woman in the newspaper, like, just en masse, essentially, because I feel like nowadays people would be so offended by that.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I have the photo for you, but I'm not going to post it online. I wanted to at least show you because it was, I think the word that the press used was unsettling. And that's exactly how I felt when I looked at it. I understand why they took this step, but it definitely was one of those things, like if you're just opening up the paper, having your morning coffee, it's scary to see that. Like, you know, this woman is dead. Yeah,
and the first thing that popped into my head, I don't know why, but my head went to 6 feet under. And I was like, I hope that they sent this female somewhere where they could make her look, you know, more presentable to take a photo.
No.
No?
No. I'll send it to you right now. I agree that probably would have been the better option, but just looking at that photo, it's clear that that was not the case.
I didn't think it was going to be the case, but you would hope so.
Yeah.
That's not the case.
No, it's not.
Jeez, was she burned?
No, I think it's just like the fuzziness of the photo. So I got that from, like, it wasn't anywhere else online other than in newspaper archives. So a lot of times when they get scanned over, it's, you know, black and white of a newspaper. Yeah, exactly. But I can see why they would use the word unnerving, or, you know, it's a bold step, I think. That's why I said it. It's a bold step to do that.
What this photo reminds me of, like the way that it's cut out and that you sent it over to me, I'm sure if people want to see it, they can Google it themselves and probably find it.
Yeah.
But it looks like an obituary type photo. That's what this looks like to me, but it would be startling to just be flipping through the newspaper and then, you know, you're met with this.
Yeah, definitely. But it did pay off, and authorities said that they'd received far more calls regarding who this woman could have been after they ran the photo than they did with just describing what she looked like. Now, one of the calls that came into authorities was from a young woman who believed it could have been her mother depicted in the photo. You see, just 3 days prior, on Friday, March 5th, this same girl had called the Springfield, Massachusetts Police Department to report her mother, 36-year-old Mary Morales, missing. A report had been filed, but for several days, the connection wasn't made that the deceased woman found in Vernon, Vermont could be Mary Morales. That is, not until this photo was run in the paper. Just a few days later, roughly around March 10th or 11th, after using her dental records for comparison, the ME confirmed that the unidentified woman found along I-91 was in fact Mary Morales.
I wonder how the daughter made the connection, because if Vermont was putting this information out in their newspaper, unless the communities were super close, how did this young girl, I don't know how old she was yet, but this young girl, how did she get the newspaper? Was this information, put on the news too? Not just the newspaper, but
Yeah, that
TV?
I'm not entirely sure of. What I do know, though, and we'll touch on it in a few minutes, is Vernon, Vermont, where Mary was found, is only about 4.5 miles into the state. So you cross over the state line, and it's, like a 5-6 minute drive where she was placed. So it's not far. So I can only imagine her daughter was looking at surrounding areas to be sure.
Yeah.
Obviously probably exhausted all options in Massachusetts and figured, let's look at neighboring states.
How old's her daughter?
We'll get there in just a minute too, but this daughter that called in, I believe, was 18.
Oh, okay. I'm thinking young. I'm thinking like 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
No.
Okay. So it makes more sense now because with the autopsy and the preliminary information, I think you stated that she was placed between like 25 and 35?
25 and 30.
25 and 30.
Yeah, so they were
So
a little
I'm thinking,
young on her age. But.
Yeah, so I was thinking, okay, if this woman's like 30 years old or a little bit older than that, maybe she only has, a 10-year-old daughter, and this 10-year-old daughter is finding this information in a newspaper.
Yeah, no.
But
She was a
she's an
full-blown adult.
Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
So in order for you to have full context of where we are so far in this story, we have to back up a little bit and go over a couple things that have led us here. I'm going to provide you with a little bit of information about Mary and her life, pretty much everything that I could find. Then we'll touch on her movements prior to when her body was found, at least the ones we know of. And then from there, we'll dive into the investigation into her murder. So, Mary Morales was born on November 5th, 1962, and was 36 years old when she was killed. Her parents were Benjamin and Neris Rivera, and she had at least one sister named Sandra. She was born in Puerto Rico, but at some point moved to the United States, but I'm not exactly sure when. Unfortunately, though, outside of those pieces of information, I don't really have any other details about Mary's early life. I do know that she had been married as of 1999 for 17 years. However, at the time of her murder, she and her husband, 37-year-old Edgardo Morales, had been separated. Now, I do just want to touch on the fact that there are some confusing aspects out there on Mary and Edgardo's relationship at the time she was killed. Almost all sources state that Mary had a boyfriend at the time, a 39-year-old man named Daryl, who lived in Greenfield, Massachusetts, which is a little over an hour drive from Springfield, where Mary lived and worked. But there are other sources that state Edgardo and Mary were still living together just prior to her murder, and the two were supposedly trying to work on their relationship. I really don't know which is more accurate, but in a little while, we're going to review some details about their marriage, which makes me think that they probably weren't living together, but who knows for sure. Now, Mary and Edgardo had 4 children together, 3 daughters, Jessica, who was 18 at the time, Naomi, who was 17, and Mary, who was 9. They also had one son who was 10 years old, and I have not been able to find his legal name, but from what I can tell, his nickname was either Macho or Nacho, which was reported both ways in a few different publications, so I really don't know which is the correct nickname. But regardless, at the time of Mary's murder, the 2 younger children were still living at home with their mother at 198 Massasoit Street in Springfield, Massachusetts, where they'd been living for the past 2 years. At this time, Jessica and Naomi had already moved out and were living their own adult lives. And I do believe at least one of the 2 older daughters had children of their own, or really it could have been both of them that had kids, as it's been stated that Mary was a grandmother of 2. Mary was described as a great mother and grandmother, and that she adored her kids and her grandkids, and was overall a very kind and loving person. Now, in terms of Mary's employment, from what I can tell, for at least the last 2 years while she'd been living in Massachusetts, maybe even a little less, she'd been working as an administrative assistant at a company called Unicare Life and Health, with her office location being in the same town she lived in, of Springfield. Mary was described as a hard worker, and she appeared to take her job very seriously. Now, on the morning of Wednesday, March 3rd, 1999, Mary went to work at Unicare Life and Health as she always did on weekdays. At around noontime, she grabbed her wallet but left her purse behind in the office and headed out on her lunch break. But Mary never returned to work after that, and the following morning is when her body was found along I-91 in Vernon. But as I mentioned before, 2 and 2 was not put together for several days that this woman found along the highway was Mary Morales, and I think that has to do with several different factors. First and foremost, Mary wasn't reported missing until Friday, March 5th, the day after her body was located. But you can't forget that Mary's 2 older daughters didn't even live at home anymore, so the delay in filing a missing persons report seems relatively fair, in my opinion. I did also just want to bring up that it is a bit unclear which daughter reported Mary missing. There were reports at first that stated it was her 18-year-old daughter who originally called police, so that led me to believe it was Jessica because it was reported that she was 18 at the time. However, later articles indicate that the person to report her missing was Naomi, who was 17. I can only assume that this is probably just misreporting or some sort of confusion on who it was for sure, but regardless, we at least know it was one of her 2 older daughters to file the missing persons report. The other factor to consider that made it difficult to confirm Mary's identity quickly is that she was found in an entirely different state. Sure, there's the argument that the states border each other and where her body was located was only about 4 to 5 miles past the Massachusetts state line, but you can't ignore the fact that she was reported missing in one state, but her body was found in another. I would expect just because of that alone that it would take longer to make an identification, as she had nothing on her or near her that would suggest who she might have been.
Yeah, I mean, who knows how often Vermont State Police converse with Massachusetts State Police?
Yeah, I mean, maybe like once a week. So you're not thinking like within a day or two you're going to have an identification. It would probably be like a week seems fair to me. Like it doesn't seem like there was this big delay or anything like that. They were obviously doing their due diligence to try and identify her. So
yeah, I don't think this was like a lapse in professional, workmanship, essentially.
Yeah, agreed.
I think it was just they were in a difficult spot. They didn't have anybody reported missing at the time in that
their
area.
State. Yeah, exactly.
In their state. They're probably talking to other municipalities within Vermont to see if they have any missing people.
Yep.
And then things take time. It's understandable why some people would say, oh, why did it take so long? But I think that's within reason.
Agreed. So it obviously wasn't until authorities put out the photo of the deceased woman in the paper that Mary's daughter called to inquire, and then that's when authorities felt as though they'd gotten a good enough lead to then obtain Mary's dental records and do the comparison. So that brings us to where we can start discussing the initial investigation into Mary Morales' murder. But before we dive into that, we need to address who the lead investigative agency was, which, knowing that there are at a minimum 2 states involved here, the waters could become a little muddied. But from the very beginning, authorities did state, quote, "We're treating this case as if it occurred in Vermont," end quote.
That's what I would have guessed because you have a deceased female victim of a homicide located in your jurisdiction.
Yep.
Even if she was last seen in Massachusetts, Massachusetts doesn't necessarily have a crime at that point.
Yep.
The crime appears to be at least
in the state of Vermont.
I guess, yeah.
I mean, regardless, even if you go back to that other comment that guy made before about, driving a body without a burial permit, then that's still a crime occurring in Vermont. So I can see why they would say, nope, Vermont State Police will handle it. They responded to the scene. They've been working to identify her. I think it just makes sense that it would be them that would take it on.
Yeah, until they gather information that proves that maybe she was murdered in Massachusetts and then transported over the line.
Correct.
Then it makes sense that Vermont would be the one investigating it.
Definitely. So, due to this, Detective Sergeant Robert McCarthy, who worked for the Vermont State Police Brattleboro Barracks, would be assigned as the investigator in charge, with Vermont State Police taking the lead. But even though they were technically the agency in charge, Massachusetts State Police, and I believe maybe even Springfield PD, were working alongside them due to the fact that most of Mary's friends and family were living in Mass, and obviously we know she lived and worked there as well. It was also stated that if it was later determined that Mary was killed in Massachusetts, as John had just mentioned, then the investigation would be transferred to the appropriate agency from the town or state of where they determined the murder to have taken place. I will say, though, there was talk about Greenfield PD being involved at some point, probably due to the fact that Mary's current boyfriend lived there. And authorities in Connecticut were involved as well, as there were actually 2 cases that had similarities to Mary's that couldn't be discounted as being connected to hers, at least early on. These two murders both involved other women who were killed and dumped on the side of the road. One woman was found along I-96 in the Stamford area, the other on Route 2 in the Hartford or New Haven, Connecticut area. From what I can tell, though, that lead didn't pan out, and there was never any confirmation, at least stated publicly, that those cases were linked, but I felt it was important to still mention them.
Yeah, I think that anytime that another PD is mentioned as having possible involvement in the investigation, it could be very little. So if you had seen mention of Greenfield being involved in the investigation, you could have had Vermont State Police contacting them saying, hey, we're coming into your jurisdiction. We need to go talk to somebody that may have information on a case that we're working, and they could have been like a liaison and gone with them, or maybe
I see. Okay.
They went there for Vermont State Police if they didn't have enough resources available to send their own troopers at the time.
Oh, interesting. I never knew that they would do that, like give them a heads up, essentially, that they're talking to someone in their jurisdiction.
They should.
Especially because it's a different state,
down,
too.
Yeah.
That's true.
Also, in case something goes down, it's like a professional courtesy.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so as per usual, we're going to review the scene first. Now, like I said before, Mary's body was left off the northbound side of Interstate 91 in Vernon, Vermont. And Vernon is approximately 53 miles or roughly a 55-minute drive from Springfield, where Mary lived and worked, and obviously where she was last seen on March 3rd. We also discussed before how Vernon is only about 4 or 5 miles into the state of Vermont, so after crossing state lines, whoever did this hadn't gotten that far into the state before leaving Mary's body where it was later discovered. Authorities did believe that it was possible that the person who killed her had driven from Massachusetts into Vermont to leave her body there, which I think makes perfect sense considering she was left on the northbound side of the highway. But it also makes me wonder if the fact that she was brought to another state was a strategic move that the killer knew would make the investigation more difficult.
It could be. I think if the murder took place on the boundaries of Massachusetts and Vermont, and they had the opportunity to, bring her just over the line, or it could be total happenstance and...
This was just the route they were traveling?
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. But just something to note, nonetheless,
Yeah, I think that to give like a murderer credit to say, oh, they were smart enough to try and bring it over here to create, a difficult investigation, I think that's giving a little too much credit to
criminals.
The criminals, yeah. A lot of times I think it's the easier answer is it just happened in that area and that's the way they were going and ended up happening that way.
Occam's razor, as we normally speak of.
Yeah.
Either way, in terms of exactly where Mary was found, it was specifically stated that the location was about a quarter-mile north of where I-91 goes over Tyler Hill Road. And yes, of course, I Googled a map of the area, which I'll have a photo of on our socials and a link to on our website. And John, I'm going to send you that map in just a second so you can take a peek. But I do just want to say one thing before we discuss, and that's that investigators stated that if the person who'd left her body in this spot had just pushed her even the tiniest bit further off the side of the road, that her body would have more than likely rolled down this steep hill into an embankment in a wooded area below. And if that had taken place, it likely would have been far longer before anyone would have found Mary's body, which begs the question, did this person want her to be found and quickly?
It could be that, or because we don't know the cause of death yet, could she have been attacked and injured and she somehow escaped from her attacker, but then subsequently died of her injuries
in this location? That I don't believe is the case. We're going to touch on that in a minute, but for now I have sent you the map of the area if you want to take a peek, and we can dive back into that in a minute.
Sure.
So when you're looking at this aerial view, you can see that there's a ton of tree coverage and wooded areas on both sides of the highway, and it's also pretty dang rural with very few houses or businesses around. And something that investigators mentioned was that this area was not heavily frequented during certain parts of the day, and the lack of homes and businesses around, coupled with the lack of traffic, would likely have made it easier for whoever left her there to do so almost undetected. Also, there was this comment regarding the fact that there were 2 rest stops between the Massachusetts and Vermont state lines and the location of where Mary's body was found, but I really don't know what exactly that means for the case or where she was found or anything like that, but this comment was brought up a fair few times in reporting, so it wasn't something that I just wanted to gloss over and figured I'd bring it up to you.
I mean, when you think rest stops, you think long-haul truckers, people traveling long distances.
Yeah.
Do you think it was like put in there as a hint to say, hey, maybe the killer is somebody that frequents the highways and travels long distances?
I don't know. I was wondering that because there's something we're going to dive into in a little bit that makes me question, like, you know, people traveling this route. And obviously you would think a highway, whether it's a 2-lane highway, 4-lane highway, regardless, you're going to have truckers that are, you know, going up and down that route.
Yeah.
So did that whole rest stop thing mean, you know, there were 2 rest stops? If you were stopped at a rest stop, did you see anything weird? Mm-hmm. Someone could have stopped there along their route before they left her body here or something like that.
Or did you see her at a rest stop?
Yeah. So I didn't know if it was like, you know, authorities want to make it known that there were these places along the route. And if you saw something, even if it seems insignificant, at least tell us.
Mm-hmm. Did she have a car?
That I don't know.
I'm wondering if they knew that she had a car or they found out she had a car and maybe her car was located at a rest stop.
I don't know, because that's one of my questions that we're going to be left with, because I don't know anything about her car.
Yeah.
Because we talked a few minutes ago about when she left work on the 3rd, and it said, you know, she grabbed her wallet, she left her purse behind. So you would assume she's probably going to just be gone for a very short span of time. If she's driving, I would assume she would bring her wallet to have her license with her. Mm-hmm. But I don't know whatever happened to her car. Did she even have a car? Did she take the bus to work? I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if it was the case, if she did have a vehicle, where was it? Did she take it when she left work? Did somebody else pick her up? I don't know.
It's just weird that they would mention these rest stops multiple times in multiple different news articles, unless there was some type of significance there, because that's kind of something you could just gloss over and you don't really have to mention.
Yeah, that's how I felt about it. I'm like, why are they bringing up these rest stops? It's so random.
Yeah.
But anyway, as we discussed before, Mary's body was located just off the side of the road, honestly mere inches from the breakdown lane, and her arm had been touching the guardrail. Authorities stated that all signs pointed to her being taken from a vehicle and placed in this spot, that she was not thrown out of a car, for example. And this comment will make a bit more sense once we discuss the autopsy findings. But we also know that she was found completely nude, no clothes on her body or near her, no wallet, which we know she had taken with her from work, and she had no jewelry on her either. So as we continue on with our discussion of the scene, I do just want to make you aware that the following information I'm going to provide to you was reported as a statement that came from a man who was interviewed at the scene where Mary's body was found. I have no clue who this person was, whether he was one of the people that called it in, or if he stopped and was maybe watching police after they'd found her and, you know, just rubbernecking essentially, but, you know, hanging out there. But I did want to bring up this statement because after Mary was identified, authorities became so tight-lipped, honestly, about like so many details of this case, that I was really only able to glean this information from reporting that was done prior to her identification. And again, this comment was made by this witness, so I wanted to just make that clear so everyone knew it wasn't like authorities that put this out.
Yep.
So according to a piece written by Susan Johnson and Stephen Seitz for the Brattleboro Reformer, quote, "The man said he saw no footprints in the snow from the woods up the embankment to the spot on the side of the road where the body was found," end quote. Which makes me believe that Mary was left in this spot near the guardrail from the breakdown lane. Like the person was obviously traveling along the highway. It's not like for some reason she was maybe held in the woods or something over here and the person came from like, I guess essentially behind the highway to put her over in this spot. So I just figured, you know, that was important. The fact that there didn't really seem to be any indicators of anyone in that area other than Mary, really. Right. So, but now that we've brought up the weather with that comment, I wanted to talk about that for a quick second. So I can't quite tell exactly how much snow there was in the area, but considering that it was early March in Massachusetts and Vermont, you'd have to think there's at least some snow accumulation left over from storms throughout the winter season. Yes, it's the tail end of winter, but being from New England, we know that anything is possible in terms of the weather here. But based on my research, it appears as though it was surprisingly mild the night of March 3rd and the early morning hours of March 4th, with the temperature getting up into the high 40s, even low 50s at some point. All that to say, I think the snow must have been from previous accumulation and that it hadn't snowed on the night of the 3rd. If anything, there may have been some rain, but not much at all based on what I've found regarding the weather in the area that night. But either way, authorities were under the impression that Mary's body was left along I-91 sometime between the afternoon of March 3rd and early morning hours of March 4th, obviously prior to 6:30 a.m. when she was seen on the side of the road and then it was called in. But I just find that to be like a really wide window of time to say, oh, it could have been sometime in the afternoon on March 3rd. People were calling like immediately as soon as the sun is rising on that Thursday morning because she was so easy to see on the side of the road. You would think if it were any time in the afternoon or early evening hours the night before, she was not there.
Yeah, most likely. I mean, if she was so easily seen, you'd think even people passing by with their headlights on would see something.
Yeah.
And even if they thought it was like a deer or something, they might have made a call to a police department to let, DEM know to come pick it up or whatever. So yeah, I would assume that her body was placed there closer to when everybody started calling.
That's what I would think too. Like probably
early morning hours of the 4th.
Exactly. I would think like 2 a.m., 3 a.m., something like that.
Yeah, and that's also a time where there's going to be less people driving on the road. You're going to have more of an opportunity, between traffic to park on the side of the road and do that.
And not be seen by literally anybody.
Right.
But outside of those couple things, that's literally all I know about the scene. And we obviously aren't aware of where the actual murder took place either, so we can't really discuss anything to do with that. And also, in terms of physical evidence or really any evidence that was gathered at the scene or on Mary's body or anything like that, there has not been one peep about anything in terms of physical evidence in this case.
So, did they later release her cause of death, or they still haven't?
Nada. Never. Not once. And we're about to touch on that in the autopsy.
Really?
Really.
That is strange. They've essentially released no information from the scene.
No.
Except for how her body was placed.
It wasn't even like authorities either, I don't think, saying like, this is what we discovered. It's more so the reporters are on scene, seeing what's happening and reporting on that, and then interviewing people who were there too, or interviewing people who called it in maybe, or something like that, and then getting that information from there. It was like, so when I was first researching this case, obviously I'm on newspapers.com and I'm searching the person's name. But when somebody is unidentified at first, you're not going to find any of those articles from that week-long span of time when she wasn't identified. So I went back and I put in like unidentified woman found or I-91, something like that. And I was able to find all the articles from when she was first found on the 4th. So I went back, and in those articles is when more was coming out and police were a little bit more loosey-goosey with their information. But again, it was still like barely anything. And it was all coupled with other people's remarks to say, this is what I saw, this is what it seemed like, this is what I called in, or...
Never an affirmative statement from the state police.
Not in the beginning. There are some statements later on, but it's all so wishy-washy. It's like they don't want you to know a damn thing.
All right, so you mentioned that we're going to learn more from the autopsy, though.
So we're going to dive into that now. As previously discussed, neither authorities nor the ME were releasing Mary's cause of death, but it was stated in some earlier articles that there were no obvious marks or wounds on her body that could indicate what her cause of death was. Despite her lack of injuries, authorities had originally considered her death to be suspicious, and then we know by the Monday after she was found, they'd confirmed that she was the victim of a homicide. And this detail about the lack of marks on her body goes back to the comment I made a few minutes ago about how investigators believed she was placed on the side of the road, not necessarily tossed out of a moving vehicle, or kind of like you mentioned before, John, like if she had been running or something like that, trying to get away, and maybe she had, just succumbed to her injuries on the side of the road. That does not seem like the case, and I think their assumption that she was placed by someone after they stopped their car there and put her there has to do with the lack of any marks on her body at all.
Well, I don't know. I'm kind of torn on this because we haven't learned a time of death. We haven't learned a cause of death, but we have learned that there were no marks or suspicious wounds on her body.
Yeah.
So when I had said before, maybe she had gotten away from her attacker. Maybe her attacker let her go. She's left nude. So sexual assault is a possibility already. If there are no marks on her, could she have been drugged? And if she had been drugged and then sexually assaulted and then just thrown out of the car, but she's still alive, but then ended up dying from whatever happened to her, could she have essentially put herself in that position after she had been thrown out of the car?
Yeah, but wouldn't you think if someone like tossed you out of a car that you would have scrapes on your knees or your arm, or like you would have some sort of mark? Like you would probably be hurt in some way, unless...
Yeah, especially if you have no clothes on too.
Yeah, you have nothing to cover yourself with. And you have to think too, like, I get that it was warmer, but you still have leftover snow, and like frozen snow hurts and that'll scrape you. So
I know, but if they're saying that she was the victim of a homicide, saying that someone's a victim of a homicide generally just puts them into the category that their death is suspicious and involves at least another person.
Yeah.
When we have no marks, they're not releasing a cause of death, a time of death. I mean, you can take out bludgeoning, stabbing, shooting, probably take out strangling. So what other... Smothering maybe with a pillow?
Maybe.
Like, where can we get to, you know...
Poison?
That's what I'm saying, drugs or something like that. I don't know. It's strange that they have been so hush-hush on the autopsy findings.
It's definitely strange, and I feel like a lot of the information that I'm gonna give you is me trying to decipher like their comments that were made. And then there was also one other statement, which I'll tell you in a few minutes, from yet another witness at the scene. So there's more details yet again that I was able to get regarding the autopsy and like what Mary's body even looked like or anything like that from witnesses, from reporters, rather than from the PD themselves.
So these are witnesses from when she was found?
Yeah, so it was said that they were witnesses interviewed at the scene. So I don't know what exactly that means. Maybe they lived nearby. It looked like there was like one or two houses over there. So maybe they had come up and, you know, were just being interviewed or something. I'm not sure.
All right.
But they all had, you know, their own comments to make. But anyway, the Brattleboro Reformer reported that the ME at the time couldn't pinpoint Mary's cause of death right away. And the exact verbiage was, quote, "No apparent cause of death was identified in the initial examination," end quote. But then the spokesman for the Vermont State Police, Sergeant Eugene Douillard, is how you pronounce it, I believe, and I'm really sorry if I'm butchering that, but I couldn't find a lot of pronunciation videos. But he stated, quote, "There are thoughts on what might have happened that have not been ruled out, but nothing has been confirmed," end quote.
And they didn't put those thoughts out either.
No. So this is something that I now want to bring up because I was very confused when I was first researching this case. And it goes back to that whole situation about when the ME arrived, when he confirmed that she was deceased, and then when her body was transported. So it was stated that when she was taken from the scene at 11 a.m., that she was brought to the funeral home. And there were comments made in reports on this case that made it seem, at least to me, like there was almost this preliminary autopsy or some sort of examination done, and then the full autopsy was completed on Friday. So based on that comment that I just read to you from the spokesman, I think that maybe there was, I don't know, this extra examination done. Like, I don't know if the ME would be just giving like a quick glance over to say, is there something identifiable here, like a gunshot wound or a stab wound or something? That's
what I assume it was too. They do a quick, you know, run through of everything before they actually start doing their autopsy because, you know, opening people up and all that. So I'm sure they were looking for, you know, obvious signs of trauma, things like that, and then put it off to the side to do whatever else because you don't know what their schedule is. If they have other people that they're about to do autopsies on, they may have to, they'll do the preliminary. That way they can start the investigation and let law enforcement know what they found, and then they'll give them the full report later on in the week. I think that's feasible to...
Yeah, that seems fair. And they did, I just want to, you know, for full transparency, it does seem as though they did figure out a cause of death after the full autopsy was done. But again, they were keeping that close to the chest. They're like, nope, we're not releasing it. So
I have thoughts on...
Oh, I have thoughts on that too, and we'll dive into that in a little while.
Not necessarily that, but I'm wondering, like, what could the cause of death be, knowing what we know now?
Yes. Well, there's a few more things that I want to tell you before you start to, like, have the wheels turning in your head, all right? So this is now the time where I'm going to give you one of those other statements from one of these witnesses at the scene. So the article that was written that, you know, this witness had been interviewed for stated, quote, The tips of the fingers were blue. She was pale, milky white, and her body was so clean. There was no blood or puncture marks. It was like she was just put there, end quote. And this individual also provided additional details, and he indicated that Mary was wearing eye makeup and that she almost looked, quote, peaceful. Then another person that was interviewed stated that the deceased woman did not appear to be frozen and that her arms and legs were, quote, flexible. Which, of course, makes you consider the state of rigor that her body could have been in.
In time of death.
Mm-hmm. So according to a piece in Science Direct, on average, it takes anywhere from 1 to 6 hours for rigor to set in, with the average being 2 to 4 hours. But that average window of time changes with temperature, and obviously I would assume other factors as well, but temperature is what stood out to me in this instance. So when it's cold, rigor takes longer to set in. It's unclear exactly how long that would take to delay the onset. That idea kind of seems to be subjective, but you have to think that if her body was still flexible, then rigor hadn't fully set in at that point.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that.
But then you have to think about the fact, like, it was pretty mild that night. And of course, that guy's saying it didn't look like she was frozen because it wasn't like -4 degrees outside. She wouldn't. It was in the 50s.
Yeah.
So then that also makes me question, is that cold enough to, kind of delay rigor, or?
I would assume that it's probably on the end towards delaying. I'm sure the colder it gets, the longer it delays. But
yeah.
The comment about her fingertips being blue too makes me wonder.
What does it make you wonder?
I'm wondering, like, if it had something to do with being cold and blood flow, and I don't know. I'm not a scientist like that, but
no, me either. I was like, all right, Science Direct, help me out here.
And also we
while
have
I was looking it up.
Yeah, and also we have to take these statements with a grain of salt. They're not coming from an official source. These are just people that remember seeing something. You don't know how accurate they are.
Yes, exactly.
But if they're saying that her legs were flexible, I'm sure that's, while authorities are moving the body, they can see that.
They can see that, exactly, yeah. But obviously, this is something that I think kind of perfectly segues us into the next piece of the autopsy results, and that has to do with Mary's estimated time of death, which John had mentioned earlier we didn't have, but the ME was able to determine some sort of window of time. So per the ME, it was determined that Mary had likely been killed sometime between 3 p.m. on Wednesday the 3rd, so that would have been about 3 hours after she'd walked out of work that day for lunch, and then sometime during the early morning hours of Thursday, March 4th, the morning her body was found. It was also mentioned at some point as well that it was believed she could have been deceased for up to 14 hours by the time she was located. So if that's the case, that would put the time of death more towards early evening on the 3rd. But either way, I feel like that is just a very wide window of time that we're talking about, especially considering that witness mentioning the lack of rigor or the fact that she was more flexible.
Yeah, before you even gave the time of death, I already had in my head, they're going to say within 12 hours.
Yeah, like it's just like your generic thing to say.
It seems like they don't have a lot of answers. It's something where they can say 12 hours because they know that she was seen, slightly before that leaving work.
Yeah.
It's just a safe thing to say, she was last seen at, say, noontime. Mm-hmm. All right, well, it probably happened, between these hours.
Yeah.
It's safe, and I don't know if they're saying that because of what they found during their autopsy, or if they're just saying that because they know that she was last seen at work a little bit more than 12 to 14 hours before that.
I feel like it could go either way.
Yeah, and I mean, both things could be influencing that too.
Yeah. But, and I mean, like you said before too, we can play devil's advocate and say, like, maybe the witness was mistaken, maybe, he didn't quite understand. But I feel like when it comes to rigor, that's pretty obvious because rigor is so foreign.
Yeah.
Like when you're looking at
And I mean, she has no
human.
clothes on too.
Yeah.
And if they were just saying that her fingertips were blue and there wasn't lividity setting in, I don't know the exact time period on lividity, but I mean, you would see all blood pooling in the body.
Exactly. From where she was laying.
Right.
It would essentially be like a big bruise is what it would look like, right?
Essentially, yes. It's gravity is just pulling all of your blood down because it's no longer flowing. So if you died on your back, all of the blood would be on your back and you would just have, like you said, almost like severe bruising, but it's really just your blood pooled there.
Yeah.
And none of that was mentioned.
No, it was not. Nope.
So I am still of the opinion that this probably happened early morning hours.
Me too.
And she was probably put on the side of the road or let out onto the side of the road early morning hours of the 4th.
So then you would have to think, though, because of the length of time from when she was last seen leaving work, so you've got at least 12 hours of her potentially being held somewhere.
Well, she never said where she was going.
No.
Never told a coworker she was going anywhere.
If she did, the police certainly didn't tell that to the public.
And you would think that she had the intention of coming back because she left her purse there.
Correct.
I don't know. I mean, we always talk about when police are starting an investigation, you talk to husband or spouse, boyfriend, things like that. And that's kind of the route that I'm thinking right now. Did she go and meet up with a boyfriend or somebody that she was seeing and something happened with them and then things kind of spiraled out of control from there?
It's not out of the realm of possibility. And I know that you haven't had very much to say yet because we're just coming off of Robert Hoagland's absolutely wild case, and I'm barely giving you anything with this one, which is just so frustrating because I just don't know a lot. But there is more that will be far more like getting the juices going as we keep going in this case. So hold out hope for that, okay?
Okay. I
want to discuss something that we actually talked about a few episodes back, and that is toxicology reports and how, at least I feel like that's something that I just never really hear about a lot in these older cases. I know 99 isn't like crazy old or anything, but it's just something that I never really come across very often. But it was mentioned in Mary's case that authorities were going to be running a toxicology test. And at the time, within the first week or so of the investigation, they were still waiting on the results. But spoiler alert, yet another thing they don't ever release to the public.
That's what I was going to guess.
Yeah. But apparently the reasoning for them even having a toxicology done in the first place, at least based on how I've interpreted the reporting on this, is that investigators weren't able to rule out the idea that drugs could have been a factor when it came to her death.
That's what I thought to begin with, because if you have no marks.
But I've never seen anything said that she used drugs or that she may have had an addiction or anything like that. I've never seen anything like that stated. So I don't really know exactly why authorities were led to believe this. Maybe they knew more than we did. But obviously, like John is saying, the lack of marks on her body has to lead you to another cause of death that would not leave any marks. Right, and like what are your options?
Like an ingested substance.
Or smothering, like you said, too. That's something that you probably wouldn't have any marks. I feel like those are your only two options.
Yeah, I think the options are very limited. But I was thinking from the get-go, like smothering was just something that I could think of. Like maybe you can kill somebody that way and there will be no identifying markers on you. But from the get-go, when you say that there is no visible physical trauma to this woman, you got to think that it's something that they ingested. Or something like a heart attack.
Could have been induced from something.
Right.
Yeah.
And even though there's no mention of Mary using drugs, she wouldn't be the first to experiment with drugs, maybe get a bad batch or take too much. And then something happens, maybe, a drug-induced heart attack. And the people that she's with are also on drugs and they don't know what to do and they don't help her. And then she ends up dying and they're like, what the hell am I going to do?
That makes me think so much of Simone Reidinger's case.
Yes.
And how, even the detectives thought, they could have been doing something, maybe recreational drugs or something they shouldn't have been doing, and then just something went bad, and then whoever was with her panicked. And
they made the wrong choice.
Exactly, yeah. So I feel like that could definitely be a possibility here. And as John and I have been discussing, obviously it is a little frustrating when in these cases, especially older ones like this, where police just aren't releasing anything.
When they have stuff to release, too.
Yeah, they do. And, you can get a little irritated on their lack of disclosure of certain facts. But there was a comment in the Brattleboro Reformer that made me kind of reframe my thoughts a little bit on the whole thing. And it states, quote, Douillard acknowledged that it's somewhat unusual for police not to release the cause of death, but he said it would help investigators segregate good information from bad. The only other person who knows the cause is the person who killed her, he said, end quote.
That's strong wording to say that the only person with information is the one that killed her.
Yeah.
So that kind of makes you lean towards, not an accidental death.
Exactly.
But intentional.
And that's probably why they labeled this as a homicide. And it just made me think, is this a very unique cause of death? One you don't hear about all the time, like obviously a poisoning or, something like that. I don't know. I mean, not that poisoning's not, common, but, you just...
It's more of a midsummer murder type.
Yeah, definitely.
Cause of death than it would be, normal
100%.
everyday circumstances.
And if you haven't seen Midsummer Murders, what are you all doing? Especially our UK listeners.
Yeah. You really got to rack your brain to figure out what means someone could have used to kill this woman that only they would know pertinent details about, that didn't leave any marks that are visible to at least the ME's initial glance and all the witnesses that gave statements from seeing her at the scene.
Yeah. It's just so strange to me. Like, what kind of options could there be?
I mean, you wouldn't see a needle prick.
No, especially I go back to Criminal Minds always, but like you think of these things where like Spencer Reed is like in the ME's office and he's like looking really closely and he's like, there's something in their mouth, or there's a mark behind their ear, or between their toes, or between
somebody
their
walked
fingers.
by and jammed him with a needle and injected him with something.
Yeah, so it's like it could be something like that, I guess, but it's like, what is it that police know that is so important that must be kept quiet for 23 years now?
With the information that we have, the only thing that I can really say seems probable to me at this point, because they haven't released if she was sexually assaulted, and we don't know the cause of death. Could this have been drug-related with a sexual partner? Or could it have been, a sexual partner that she was doing drugs with and then had some type of medical emergency, and because...
Not everyone reacts in the way they're supposed to.
Right, and because, they were high on drugs or whatever, they didn't know what to do, or they made the wrong decision.
Yeah.
Then what happened after the fact is what happened.
And you have to think that, especially after a full autopsy and this full examination...
Give us a toxicology and give us whether or not she was sexually assaulted. And if they say, you can't tell if she was sexually assaulted, but it does look like she had intercourse at some point within the past 12 hours.
Yeah. But the thing I'm trying to get at is, so they said that they knew that this was a homicide the Monday after the autopsy was completed, yet they were still ordering a toxicology. What in her body could indicate that she was definitely killed by somebody else, and they need to confirm what's in her system? Like, those two things I feel like are key to knowing or trying to decipher what the cause of death could be.
I think that labeling it a homicide or saying that she was the victim of a homicide, I still don't think it's indicative that she was purposefully murdered.
Yeah, but then you have the
other guy
saying flat out that this is the person, or that only the person that killed her would know this. So it's very weird, and I feel like you can go either way with it, and I'm sure...
But I guess if you think of this, right? If two people are doing drugs together, and one of them overdoses or is having a medical emergency at that time, and you fail to provide medical aid or assistance, would this law enforcement officer say that you killed them?
I see exactly what you're saying, and I feel like no, but I can also see the other side of that, because in that instance, like, especially if you're not in the right frame of mind, you might react too slow, you might be passed out yourself.
Right, I'm not saying in your opinion. I'm saying, what was the Douillard?
Douillard. It's
Douillard?
Douillard.
Okay, so you have Sergeant Douillard saying that the only person that would know this information is the one that killed her. I'm asking you, that scenario that I just painted, would he consider that person that didn't provide aid to the other one, would he say that they killed them?
I think that's a subjective answer, and I think everyone could give you a different opinion on that. So yes, he might see it that way, or they could see it completely differently and just know more and be like, no, this definitely was a murder, and you're all theorizing for the wrong reasons,
So, like you said, that's a subjective answer. And this sergeant wasn't reading from a script. He was talking off the cuff. He's probably upset about what happened to this woman. And I still don't think that by labeling her the victim of a homicide, that she is the victim of being murdered like intentionally murdered,
Mm-hmm.
because somebody can be charged with manslaughter, an accidental killing, and that case will still be generally under the umbrella of a homicide.
Yeah,
so,
I see what you're saying.
In that scenario that I just played for you, where the two people are doing drugs and one doesn't provide aid to the other one and lets them die, would they be charged with murder? No, maybe manslaughter. Yeah.
I see exactly what you're saying. Yep.
I'm thinking that, again, just based on the information that we have, it seems as though something happened while she was with somebody that she knew or that she chose to be around. They made the wrong decision and then didn't provide her the help or the aid that she needed, eventually died, and they needed to get rid of the body or get rid of their connection to her, put her on the side of the highway where they knew she would be found only a short time later. Like you said, she could have been thrown over the embankment and she'd be down in a gully or something.
Yeah, and who would have found her at that rate, especially considering that it was still March, there was snow there, so it's like...
All the things that we know now lead me to believe that the person who left her there wanted her to be found. The fact that she had no visible physical damage to her body from being struck or stabbed or anything like that. They can't tell if she was sexually assaulted, or they won't release that, I should say.
Yeah.
They haven't released the toxicology report. It just leads me down that road to believe that this was not somebody that set out to kill her.
Yeah, I totally see what you're saying there, and I think I agree so far at this point. So we're going to move on now to what I'm calling the tips and leads category of this investigation. Authorities were, of course, receiving tips and leads without really working for them. Just based on the reporting that was done in regards to Mary's murder, people were gonna call in. But investigators did actually do something that I thought to be quite clever in their attempts to garner even more leads to run down. So on Thursday, March 11th, 1999, authorities put together a team of 10 officers and set up a roadblock along Interstate 91 in Vernon, approximately a half mile from where Mary's body had been located. And this roadblock began at around midnight and lasted until roughly 6 a.m. that morning. Authorities chose this date specifically due to the fact that it was exactly 1 week to the day of when it's believed Mary's body was left off the side of the highway. So they figured people would likely be taking the same route they did every Thursday, obviously now that morning on the 11th, and maybe those people had seen something the week before and just hadn't come forward yet.
Or maybe the suspect
could have been traveling that route
again too.
Exactly. Now, during that roughly 6-hour period of time, investigators stopped over 750 vehicles, truckers included, and provided them with flyers about Mary's murder, and also questioned them briefly on if they had seen anything suspicious the Thursday before. Maybe they'd seen a strange vehicle parked in the breakdown lane. Maybe they spotted someone dropping something out of a car on the side of the road, or maybe they'd even seen Mary's body but couldn't quite tell what it was due to how dark it might have been. But if any of those things were the case, then authorities could work to dwindle the timeline of when Mary was left there down even further. Authorities were, of course, also asking the public to reach out to them if they'd seen anything suspicious or out of the ordinary that night, even if they weren't being stopped, during this roadblock in the area. Now, according to Susan Johnson's reporting for the Brattleboro Reformer, authorities were able to gather some leads from the roadblock, but it's unclear exactly what those were. But Susan also specifically reported in that same piece, quote, "The final hours of Morales' life were uncovered," end quote. So I'm assuming this statement is in regards to these leads they'd gotten after questioning these drivers, because that's essentially what the whole piece was about. But I'm very curious, what this statement means, and I want to know more. But spoiler alert yet again, something else that was never further clarified. No details, nothing about these leads, nothing about that very important statement ever stated publicly.
And who put out that statement?
The Brattleboro Reformer was the publication that published it.
But they weren't quoting someone?
No, that was within her piece. But I would assume if she knew that, she's probably speaking with
police
or someone's telling her something. How did you find out the final hours of her life based on this roadblock? Did someone see a lot more than you would think that they would have seen?
So I guess I'm confused. So this was put out in the newspaper, written by whoever. And how did they get the information from the roadblock? Police must have given them the information?
I mean, you would think so. But they don't have to. They don't have to name their sources. Yeah, exactly.
Interesting, but that's a bold statement to say.
Yeah.
And when did that article come out?
In 99.
I mean, that's a bold statement to say and then not have any movement on it for almost 23 years.
Yeah.
Or more than 23 years.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's
You
like,
can't
if
always
this
trust
case
these
got
publications,
solved,
though.
of course not. But like, if this case got solved and we found out all that information, that would have been one thing. But it's like,
Right.
if you knew exactly what her movements were in the last moments of her life,
Then you must
and
know
then
who
for
killed her.
23 years, nothing has happened,
Yeah, I
and
don't get it.
essentially you're still at a dead end, that makes no sense to me.
Yeah, I don't get it. But we got more, right?
We got more.
All right.
Meanwhile, other leads investigators were working had to do, again, with Mary's missing clothing. We'd discussed before what was found in the Burger King dumpster, but regrettably, that turned out to be a dead end, as it was concluded that the clothing found in the dumpster had not belonged to Mary. But due to the fact that investigators were unable to locate any of her clothing, they put out a plea to the public asking anyone to come forward if they located any clothing that they believed could have belonged to Mary. They also wanted people to come forward that may have known what she was wearing on March 3rd when she left for work, because at this point in their investigation, authorities were not even aware of what her attire was that day. So they're like, oh yeah, if you find her clothing, let us know, but like, we also don't know what she was wearing.
It's so odd that you don't have any of this information coming from coworkers, or if she didn't have a car and she rode the bus, anybody that rode the bus with her. Because if she takes the bus to work, she must take the bus with the same people, probably going a similar route all the time.
Yeah.
A lot of holes in this one.
Oh yeah, but even though authorities lacked details on what she could have worn that day, obviously they were putting out whatever it is that they could assume. So they said, you know, her clothing likely would have been business casual or business professional in nature, as she had been at work when she was last seen. And then it was also stated that the clothing likely would have been a pretty small size, as Mary was only 5 feet 5 inches tall and 98 pounds. Authorities were also interviewing all the employees at the insurance company where she worked to gather more info about her, what her day was like, how she was acting, and of course, if anyone there had spoken to her and had any sort of recollection of what she was wearing. But again, we never find out about that. Now, in case you're wondering, authorities did search a few miles of area along both northbound and southbound sides of I-91 for her clothing, but had no luck finding it. But by mid-March of 99, authorities stated they had gotten several leads regarding discarded clothing that was, quote, suspicious in nature. However, yet again, it's a common occurrence in this case. We never find anything else out about it. Also, one more thing that I want to touch on that we don't ever hear about is that surveillance footage. I don't know if there was anything suspicious or strange or weird on that footage. That whole thing is still a mystery, and I don't know about any other surveillance video that could have been reviewed from the area.
Where was the surveillance footage found? Like, where did they collect it from?
I would assume the Burger King.
But I thought we already determined that the Burger King wasn't her clothes.
It wasn't, but it was like 6 minutes from the location of where her body was found. So if they're like mentioning these rest stops and now they're mentioning this Burger King, like, was it somewhere nearby? Did they think maybe
But once you find out that the clothes isn't hers,
then you're probably
not
thinking,
going to get anything from the footage.
Exactly. But if a Burger King somewhere in this area had surveillance, what else could? And a lot of times at rest stops, there's like McDonald's or fast food restaurants. Could there have been footage at any of those places that they could have reviewed and seen if someone was with Mary, or if they saw her on the footage, or if she had a car, which again, we still don't know if she did or not, but if her car was there or something, I feel like those would be things that they would be looking into.
Do we find out more about Daryl?
So, obviously, another lead that investigators were working at the time centered around Greenfield. We had talked about that before, that the Greenfield PD had gotten involved. John gave a good reason why, they could have been, just as a courtesy thing, Vermont State Police talking to them about obviously wanting to talk to Daryl. That makes sense. He's her boyfriend at the time, allegedly. But it was reported that detectives had interviewed him, but they declined to state publicly whether he was a person of interest or a suspect in Mary's murder. And even as time went on, it was never really clarified if he was ever considered a suspect or a person of interest, but it was stated that he hadn't been formally questioned and that he was fully cooperating with authorities. So I just don't know.
As of when?
As of 99. Because so after 99, there's not reporting for another decade.
Okay.
So.
We've also talked about cases and watch documentaries about other cases and stuff where people are spoken to early on in an investigation, and then years go by and they change their tune. It turns out they were involved. and all this. So, but as far as 99 goes, Daryl was cooperative,
Mm-hmm.
and he wasn't even formally named a person of interest or suspect.
Correct.
But he was
yes.
never formally questioned either.
Yeah, at that point, authorities were saying, like, this was one thing they kept saying publicly, which was very interesting to me, was that no one was being seriously questioned. That no one was like,
Why?
I don't know. Like, why aren't you grilling people? Don't you want to find out what's
She
going
was at
on?
least with somebody the last time she was alive.
She had to have been.
Because how would she get to the side of the road on the highway?
Yes. So that's my question. It's like, why hasn't anybody been seriously questioned? Why is it just like basic interviews? Do you just not know anything and that's why you're not putting anything out because you have no info?
No, it's
Or-
because nobody is ever going to come forward and make up a story, or if it were the truth, say, oh yeah, we were having sex, we were doing drugs, and, I woke up after falling asleep and she was dead on the side of me, and I
Panicked
and I needed to get rid of the body because I didn't want to get tied to the drugs that we had been doing and her death, and I didn't want to get wrapped up in this. So, nobody's going to come out and say that unless their conscience is eating at them.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those things where sometimes you have to put out more information because someone who has been in a situation like that likely hasn't kept it to themselves all these years. They've probably, if not confessed to it, alluded to it.
Right. Or say they put out the toxicology report and say she had heroin in her system.
Mm-hmm.
And one of her friends or acquaintances or something knew that somebody she was hanging around with either dealt heroin or did heroin.
Mm-hmm.
At least they can now say, oh, she had heroin in her system?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know this person is
Yep.
connected to that.
Yes.
And you need to go talk to Joe Schmo because he might
Joe
know something
Schmo's
about
back
this.
in this episode.
But yeah, putting out a little bit more information could benefit them. And I think that they're only doing a disservice. I mean, we're still in 99 as far as reporting goes.
Yeah.
But it appears as though they're just doing a disservice to the family if they're pushing for answers in this and they want to know what happened to the mother.
Yeah.
It just seems like it's not high on their priority list to get this case solved.
It's what it feels like.
Because they could put out very little things like, oh, in the toxicology report, we found this. Oh, we do not believe she was sexually assaulted.
Yeah,
Or,
it
"We
doesn't
do
have to
believe."
be your whole case file.
Right.
And I had like a whole preachy thing that I was going to talk about at the end of this. So we'll table it for now. But, I just think that there's a little bit more that could come out, from police that would be very beneficial in this case. So
Right. I mean, I think this goes with all cases and we've talked about this before, and I may sound preachy too, but
we'll talk about it again, folks. I am sure.
it may coincide with kind of with what you were going to say. But when you have these cases that have gone decades without being solved and you haven't put out a lot of information, look through your case folder and find these little things that you can put out that may spark interest in one person or may, catch the attention of one person that knew her back in the day, and that may give you some type of path to go down to maybe question somebody else.
Well, that's the thing too. I think like renewing interest in the case.
Right. You put out something that hasn't been released for almost 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
It might get people's attention.
Yeah, you had a flurry of coverage in 99. Literally by June of 99, done. Not again until 2009, one update article, and then one more in 2017. That is all you have. You have to get the public interested again.
Right.
And I know interested might seem like, this almost taboo word to use, but like...
Public interest is what drives these investigations forward because more people that know about it, they want to know more information, more people that are talking about it. The news networks catch on to it and they're like, oh, people are interested in this. We can get more clicks by talking about this and just moving that wheel forward.
Yeah, and then you have the people of web sleuths that do their crazy freaking digging and find info that I have no idea where the heck they find it. And obviously in an older case, it's good to have those web sleuths out there doing these things. In more recent cases, maybe not, because they could be hurting people's livelihoods by all the speculation. But I think in an older case like this, it's good to find those details and it's good to dig deep and theorize and try and figure out what could have happened, because you could be bringing up something that authorities have never even thought of.
Yeah, I think that going back to it's more beneficial on older cases than it is on current cases. When we're talking about older cases, we're talking about something that authorities have probably already exhausted a lot of their options on. Mm-hmm. So by putting out the information to people that may have more time and resources available to dig into whatever niche they're interested in, that helps with those old cases. When you have new cases that are out, like the Idaho case that's going on right now, and you have all these people putting in their 2 cents, but you also have a huge law enforcement presence that are actively working on it, sometimes they can kind of clash and they can work against each other.
Yeah, exactly. As the Idaho detectives are saying, literally putting out press releases saying, stop it now. You literally could be charged for,
I can only imagine what people are putting out there.
Well, they're talking about all these people that have been cleared so far by police, and all the web sleuths of the world or the armchair detectives of the world are like, well, I don't agree with police, and I think that they need to look into this guy more, and that, I think his alibi is shit, and I think this guy probably did it, and like they're ruining these people's livelihoods and their reputations by like spewing this stuff on the internet, because obviously it ends up everywhere because the case is so heavily publicized right now.
Right.
Like, what are you doing to these poor people who, sure, maybe police screwed up. You never know, but if they have their eyes on someone and you have your eyes on someone that's already been cleared, what are you doing to that person? Like, that's so horrible. Would you want them to do that to you? Dig up all your dirty laundry? Come on.
Or create fake dirty laundry.
Exactly, that too.
Even worse.
Yeah, so that's a whole thing, but.
Preach.
Yes. Now, of course, authorities were also speaking with people who knew Mary and were trying to uncover if she had any ties to the Vermont area. Not only that, neighbors were also spoken to, and reporters had even interviewed some of Mary's neighbors, and through those interviews, new information was brought to light about personal things going on in Mary's life. It was reported that Mary had been, quote, under considerable stress recently and had lost weight, end quote. And in terms of her weight loss, it was stated that she had lost upward of 12 pounds, which, if you ask me, is a significant amount of weight to lose, especially with her being so small already.
Yeah, I mean, if you said that some 400-pound person lost 12 pounds, it's not necessarily as impactful as somebody that weighs 110 pounds losing 12 pounds.
Yeah, that's like a high percentage of her body weight. So what she would have been 110 pounds,
right? And
then she lost, that significant amount of weight. And it was mentioned that the stress she was under was due to, quote, personal problems, which I initially believed to be maybe marriage related. We had talked earlier about the strange living situation with Edgardo and the fact that the couple was separated, but we can't say exactly for sure that that was the cause of her stress. But there is more on that in just a few minutes, because now is about the time where we're going to discuss a lead. And yes, it does have to do with Mary's husband. So just a few days after the roadblock took place, around March 13th, reporting regarding Mary's husband began flooding the local papers. And I do just want to make it known that the only comments made by authorities regarding their search for Edgardo Morales was that they just wanted to talk to him, and it was an obvious step in their investigation to interview the spouse.
Why are you saying search?
Well, the headlines surrounding this whole scenario were titled like, quote, police looking for victim's husband, or whereabouts of husband of slain woman is a mystery, end quote.
So should we assume that he fled the area after her death?
Well, in some of these articles, Edgardo, I guess now he's technically the estranged husband, was described as being, quote unquote, missing. But I'll tell you, I don't think it was meant that he was involuntarily missing. And I think you'll probably agree once you hear the rest of the story. But before we dive into what happened on March 3rd, which allegedly involved Edgardo, let's first back up a bit to discuss his penchant for becoming untraceable by police. So it was reported that approximately a year prior to Mary's murder, she'd filed a restraining order against Edgardo. Said order was issued by the court on February 5th, 1998, and extended once to February 17th, 1998, but because of Edgardo's mysterious vanishing act, the restraining order was never served. And I'm sure you'd like details regarding why Mary even filed this order in the first place. Well, Edgardo allegedly threatened Mary in front of some other man at her home, and that's why she originally filed the order. But more details were revealed in a piece in the Brattleboro Reformer that stated, quote, Morales is quoted in her statement as saying that Edgardo had threatened to kill both her and her alleged boyfriend, end quote, who, at the time, was Daryl, that guy from Greenfield. The Rutland Daily Herald also provided additional details stating that Daryl, quote, restrained her husband from beating her by threatening him with a baseball bat, according to the court records, end quote.
So at the time of this alleged incident, there was no arrest made. Police didn't respond to this. This was Mary going to court, alleging these facts, and getting a restraining order or a no-contact order put in place.
I believe so, yes.
Then Edgardo disappears, so they can't serve him with his paperwork. So the next time he was around her, maybe threatening her again or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
The order is technically not in place because he hasn't been served with the papers yet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, interesting.
Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, as police were searching for Edgardo, they were asking his kids if any of them knew of their father's whereabouts, to which they all told authorities they had no idea where he was. And that same Vermont State Police spokesman, Douillard, stated, quote, "Everyone's a suspect until they're ruled out. Edgardo Morales could be in Puerto Rico. He could be somewhere else in Western Massachusetts. We haven't been able to find him. If his children know where he is, they're not telling. It's too early in the investigation to make definitive statements," end quote.
What's annoying about that is that he's saying everybody's a suspect until they're not, yet they're not formally questioning anybody at this point, it seems.
Yes, exactly. And then they're saying, oh, it's too early to make definitive statements. It's like, it's too early for you to not make any statements is what it seems, other than like these ambiguous ones that no one knows anything that you're actually trying to get at.
Yeah. So has Edgardo ever been found?
Yes, he has. And I'm surprised that you didn't say, was he in Puerto Rico? As I mentioned.
Well, that's what I was going to get at. Was he
Yeah.
ever found, or is he, on the beach in Puerto Rico right now?
Yeah, he's not on the beach in Puerto Rico, from what I understand. And within several days of all these headlines, being publicized about where is, her estranged husband, the FBI ended up receiving a tip stating that he could have fled to Puerto Rico. And you guessed it, that's exactly where the FBI ended up finding him. Investigators traveled to Puerto Rico and arrested Edgardo Morales on March 18th on outstanding charges stemming from an alleged incident that occurred in Massachusetts on March 3rd, 1999. But those charges were not for his wife's murder.
Then what were they for?
You're about to find out.
It's either going to be something serious, or it's something totally BS that they're just using as a way to go down to Puerto Rico, extradite him back to Vermont or Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And they're just using this small charge as a way to do that.
What you're saying makes perfect sense. But I do just want to touch on one thing before I tell you about the whole March 3rd incident. So, again, the same Vermont State Police spokesman made a statement about the fact that, Morales was arrested in that whole situation, saying, quote, "Morales is not officially a suspect. His status hasn't changed. He was arrested on an outstanding Massachusetts warrant that has nothing to do with this case," end quote.
I thought everybody was a suspect until they're not.
Yes, exactly. And then it's funny you say that because it seems like authorities completely changed their tune by, the next couple of days, really, with the spokesman saying now at this point, quote, "He's still on the list. He's still a suspect, but he's the same. It's not greater since this morning," end quote.
So the overarching term is everybody's a suspect until they're a suspect, but until they're formally named as a suspect,
they're not a suspect.
Right. They're kind of putting it as two different levels.
Yeah.
They see everybody as a suspect, but until they're named as a suspect,
then they're
not a
not.
suspect, but they're not a suspect. You know what I mean?
Yes, that's exactly what it seems like. But I'm sure you're itching to hear about this alleged incident from March 3rd, 1999, which we obviously know is the same day that Mary went missing. So on the morning of March 3rd, 1999, around 11 a.m., so this was about an hour before Mary would have even left work for lunch, Edgardo Morales allegedly shot a man in, I believe, Springfield, Massachusetts. It was described as the city, so that's what I'm assuming. And apparently this man that Edgardo allegedly shot was named Luis Gonzalez, and he'd claimed that Edgardo and another man by the name of Luis Rios had brandished their handguns and fired 15 shots at him while he was outside of a restaurant located on the corner of Main and Huntington Streets. From what I can tell, Luis Gonzalez was shot in the leg while he was trying to get away from the two shooters. Now, assumably, after Gonzalez alerted police of who he believed shot at him and likely wanted to press charges, that's when the charges were filed, and authorities subsequently began their search for Edgardo Morales. I do believe both men that were allegedly involved in this shooting ended up charged, but I could only locate Edgardo's charges.
I just picture Edgardo and this other Luis guy walking up with their gun turned sideways and just blasting off 15 shots.
Like what, in the middle of the city?
I know, but you only hit the guy once in the leg while he was running away.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So it's reported that Edgardo was charged with the following: possession of a firearm without a license, armed assault with intent to murder, assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, as well as a possession of ammunition without identification, And lastly, discharging a handgun near a highway or dwelling. I did see in another report in the Brattleboro Reformer that he was also charged with armed robbery with the intent to kill, but it's unclear what the robbery aspect here would have been.
Well, I wonder if if the two guys were robbing this other Louise. It had to be
that wasn't clarified, but
it had to be some type of transaction, and then they brandished the firearm, forcibly took whatever they ended up stealing, and then he fled.
Yeah.
And they shot at him. That's what it would seem.
Possible. But as much as this situation is mind-boggling, authorities did state that they did not believe this shooting and Mary's murder were connected, that they were just two completely unrelated incidents. Now, as we already know, Edgardo was in Puerto Rico, and after the FBI located him there, he was going to need to be extradited back to the United States. And of course, authorities planned to question him when he arrived back to the Massachusetts area.
I just got to stop and say, though, if this incident with Edgardo and Louise occurred prior to Mary's disappearance, you would assume that right after this happened, he was like, I'm getting the fuck out of here, and left. So do you really think that he's connected to his wife's murder?
I don't know.
And I wonder if he was involved, Edgardo that is, if he was involved in some type of organized crime or gang-related crime or something like that, and maybe that was some of the stressors.
That is what's been reported, that, he had some sort of involvement in the drug world back in 99.
Making me think of The Sopranos.
I know. I was thinking that.
Going to shake somebody down and get their money and stuff.
I was you know what popped into my head too when I was envisioning like where he was outside of that restaurant where they all sit in front of that like meat store or whatever. And I was like, I could literally see someone like coming up from the other side of the road and like attacking him. It totally gave me Soprano vibes. That's funny.
Yeah. So I wonder if
it's not funny that this man was shot, but
no,
just the comparison.
The Soprano thing. It makes me wonder if the stresses that caused Mary to lose this weight could have been drug related, and the stress of, living with Edgardo while being separated while he's involved in all this other crazy shit.
While also having 4 children with him.
Yeah.
So anyway, according to a couple of articles written on this whole matter with Edgardo, he was given until March 27th to make the decision if he'd willingly go back to the States. But even if he were to put up a fight, authorities did say that they would attempt to get a warrant from the governor, I guess to essentially force him to come back. But by Tuesday, April 6th of 99, Edgardo appeared to be back in Massachusetts and was going to be questioned by police in reference to Mary's murder. Now, before we dive into what Edgardo had to say about his wife's murder when authorities questioned him, I first wanted to mention that I guess he'd originally told the FBI, I assume when he was arrested, that he did know that his wife had been killed. It's unclear how he knew that, whether a family member told him, maybe he read it in the paper.
I think that's probably...
Who knows, but yeah, he was
the most
aware.
likely thing is that his daughters probably called him, or he called his daughters, or
But if they didn't know where he was...
I'm sure he did. I mean, if he so frequently can go back and forth to Puerto Rico, I mean, I'm sure he probably knew their numbers or something.
But you would think that if they knew where he was, that the children would have told police. I mean, maybe not, but...
Who knows?
Yeah.
Or
he's
watching the news because he knows that he just shot this guy and he wants to know what's going on. And then they're like, oh, we just found this woman and blah, blah, blah. So he's following his own case to know if police are onto him. And maybe while watching the news or,
reading the paper
or whatever, he learns of his wife.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Or he was involved.
Or maybe. Who knows?
But I think that's pretty low on the totem pole for me.
Yeah. I guess the timing technically matches up, but we'll dive into it more in a minute when we cover theories.
Yep.
But anyway, once Edgardo was interviewed by police in the States, he claimed he had absolutely nothing to do with his wife's murder and that he had no involvement whatsoever. But because he was allegedly involved in this shooting the morning of March 3rd and his wife went missing that same day, it's not totally out of the question, in my opinion, to think that him fleeing to Puerto Rico the same day is suspicious. But after this big flurry of media coverage after Mary was killed and Edgardo was located, reporting slowed way down. And that's what I was talking about before with how there were, a bunch of articles in March, April of 99. Then you get a handful more through till June and then nothing for years. But after the first month or so of the investigation, the assigned officers to the case dwindled down to 2 or 3, when it had originally been 6 that were pretty much solely dedicated to the case. And like I said before, by June of 99, all reporting appeared to cease, and I think that's likely because nothing new was being released by investigators outside of the fact that both Edgardo and Daryl were still being looked into, but it was mentioned by authorities that neither were considered prime suspects in the case. Now, fast forward a decade, and finally, there's some additional coverage on Mary's case again, and yet again, it was reporting in the Brattleboro Reformer. So now, at this point in 2009, the lead investigator on the case was Detective Richard Holden with the Vermont State Police. This new coverage on the case stated that investigators believed that Mary was more than likely murdered in Massachusetts, and her body was transported and then left in Vermont, which I think is what we had kind of assumed since the beginning, but it appears as though there was really no evidence to indicate that that had happened other than a hunch, so I'm guessing that that's why the case is still with the Vermont State Police. It was also mentioned that there had been several persons of interest over the years as authorities continued to investigate, but outside of the early reporting that mentioned Edgardo and Daryl, it's completely unclear who any other potential persons of interest might have been. Now, something I found particularly interesting regarding the reporting from 2009 had to do with this comment. It states that there is a, quote, huge case file related to Morales' death, end quote. And Detective Holden said, quote, the case doesn't just sit there. There are things you can always do, things to review, end quote. So the reason why I wanted to bring this up goes back to how I mentioned earlier that I was going to get on my soapbox about the lack of details being reported in this case. And outside of one thing that I found reported in 2009 that I'm going to bring up in just a minute, there have been no new details released in this case. There's like literally nothing new. It's all I've told you. And if the detective is saying there's this massive case file with all this info, why can't you give like the tiniest little tidbits? Because if you've had this case in front of you, or probably in front of multiple detectives over the last 23 years, why is there no movement? Why does Mary not have justice?
And why hasn't more information been put out to the public?
That's what I'm saying.
That could potentially help you, because if you're saying that it's never tabled and it's always being worked on and this and that, well, if you had two suspects or two persons of interest or two suspects that aren't named as suspects in Edgardo and Daryl, but nothing else has, transpired since then in 23 years, you moving at a snail's pace or something? Or do you have something else to work on? Or
yeah, that's what I can't understand. And you can't say that they don't have anything because the detective flat out said we have this massive case file.
I mean, we also know that they have things, very specific things that they haven't released.
Exactly. And I just wonder.
Yeah, I just think if you're going to come forward and you're going to talk to newspapers and you're going to say, oh, we're always working on it. It's never tabled. It's never put on the back burner. We're always trying to get more. Well, the next step that you need to do in order to get more, in order to garner the public interest and hopefully get more leads to work or information to close a lead that you're currently working or whatever, you need to give more to the public and say, hey, this is what we know. Here's something we haven't released before. Here's something that we've kept from the public for 23 years. This is a toxicology report. We don't believe she was sexually assaulted. And one other interesting fact that would catch people's attention.
And that also someone might have knowledge of as well. Like you were mentioning before, like obviously that would have to do with the toxicology, but if there was a certain drug in her system, then someone can think back and say, I knew Joe Schmo who was into this, and
they always hung out after she left work, or they used to get lunch together or something like that.
Yeah, and you're still at a point in this investigation where this didn't happen in 1975, and you have people who have died and you can't ask them. 23 years, yes, it seems like a long time, but it's also not a long time in the span of people's lives.
No, I mean, she was 36, so she'd be what, almost 60?
Yeah, and there's got to be plenty of people who still would know something by now. So that's the soapbox about releasing information, but I just think it would be really beneficial in this case because for at least the last 5 years, there's been no talk, and there have been multiple very long spans of time where nobody is talking about Mary, and that's just not right.
Yeah, I agree. Either investigators are sitting on information that maybe they'll get a lucky break and they'll be able to move forward with it, or they got to give some more.
I agree. Yeah. But as of today, the case is still with the Vermont State Police, and it does seem as though the Massachusetts State Police is still assisting. Now, as we dive into theories, I want to start with the one thing I just mentioned that was discussed by investigators in 2009, which essentially is a theory in and of itself. and it was being considered that Mary's murder could have potentially been a retaliation towards Edgardo due to his involvement in the drug world back during the time that Mary was killed.
I just want to try and debunk that right off the bat.
Okay.
If this was a retaliation killing in regards to drugs and money and shit like that, she wouldn't have no marks on her.
Mm-hmm.
She probably would have been disarticulated or something.
Or shot.
Or
That's what I was like. It just brings me back to like Sopranos.
Right. I mean, she wouldn't just be found, quote unquote, peaceful on the side of a highway, easily found. Like,
yes, I agree. And the other thing that I was thinking had to do with the fact that, like, why would they target Edgardo's essentially soon-to-be ex-wife? Like, is it because she's the mother of their children? Like, I don't know. I just feel like a retaliation is such a random thing. And, like, also for them to put out that one thing in 2009, like, this is what we think it could have been. Like, what do you have that makes you think that?
No, I don't agree with that theory.
Well, the thing that's annoying, though, is, like, there are essentially no other theories outside of, like, maybe Daryl, maybe Edgardo, but we've already essentially debunked both of those. But I wanted to make one comment to you that didn't really make sense to me before, but I think the more that we've talked about it, I'm wondering if there's, like, a witness statement about this whole situation. So at first, I looked at Find a Grave. So I saw this random comment listed in, like, the write-up, like the very brief write-up about her case, and it said that it was believed she accepted a ride home that afternoon. And then I ended up actually finding a Sun Community News article that said the same thing, that she more than likely accepted this ride and that she also more than likely knew the driver, and that person could have been her murderer. So I'm wondering, like, is that something police have, and they know maybe she didn't actually have a car and she ended up getting a ride from this particular person? Did someone see that person? Did they describe that person?
I don't know. Is it known to be fact that she left her purse?
That, yes.
At work?
Mm-hmm.
And it was in the middle of the day that she left, right?
Yeah, and that's what threw me off. I'm like, okay.
I mean, getting in a car with somebody could be factual, but is it accepting a ride home? Or is it getting in a car with somebody and going somewhere to do something?
Exactly. It was a very random comment, and those were the only two places I ever found it. I didn't find it in any early reporting on the case, nothing from, these bigger publications like the Brattleboro Reformer, nothing like that.
Yeah, I mean, using deductive reasoning, she left in the middle of her shift, in the middle of the day, probably around lunchtime. What was it?
It was noon, yeah.
Yeah, it was noontime. She left her purse there, but she took her wallet.
I used to do that all the time.
I mean, I think it would be more reasonable to believe that she got in a car with somebody to go do something.
Go grab lunch.
Right,
or
go grab lunch.
Go shopping.
Go buy drugs or something like that. More so than accepting a ride home.
Yeah, I just thought it was such a strange thing. And obviously she's not going to get into this car, if she did get into a car with some stranger, because she knows she needs to get back to work. It's not like she's trying to hitchhike or something like that.
Right, but I wouldn't say that we should totally rule out the information given in that, because if somebody saw her getting into a car and somebody knew that driver, that's a good connection. So whereas they may have gotten the facts wrong saying that she got a ride home or she accepted a ride home, but somebody did see her getting into a car with somebody, that's still very valuable information, because that's probably one of the last people to ever see her alive. Very
true, yeah. And I just wonder if police know who that person is, or if they have some sort of description of that person or something like that. And like I said before, you have Edgardo as a potential because he was a person of interest. You had Daryl as a potential because he was also a person of interest. But like I said, in more recent years, it seemed as though police, at least based on like June of 99, authorities said that, they're not prime suspects. So how can you even theorize of their involvement?
Yeah, and that hasn't been touched on. It just doesn't seem
accurate at all.
Right, but their involvement hasn't been touched on really any further in all this time.
No, not at all. But I have to say, like, regarding Daryl too, like, he protected her against Edgardo, and, he seemed to care about her from the very little bit that I know.
Yeah.
So I just don't see that being a possibility.
Yeah, it's very difficult to link a person to the theory of how she died, because you only have your two main individuals, because they weren't really persons of interest or suspects or whatever, in Edgardo and Daryl. But I think based on the information that's been released and based on what we know, we can still theorize upon how she may have died, but we need more information to be released to try and link to who may have been involved or who may have been one of the last people to see her alive, or who was the person to drop her off on the side of the highway.
Yeah, well, I have two other things that I want to tell you before, if you want to dive into that whole
Yeah, go ahead.
scenario. But so outside of, this random other person she might have gotten in the car with, or Edgardo or Daryl, it has been theorized that a serial killer could have been involved, but no specific serial killer has ever been mentioned outside of like this specific explanation. And this was actually mentioned in the very beginning because remember those girls that were found in Connecticut along the highways? So in a lot of the reporting, it mentioned that it could have been a serial killer who was operating on Massachusetts and Connecticut highways back in the 80s and 90s. But it's completely unclear who this potential serial killer was, and I tried to find any from this area. The Connecticut River Valley killer did not leave their victims along the highway. We covered the New Bedford Highway serial killer very early on when we first started our podcast, and Mary's case was so long after those. Those cases were all 88, 89, so that didn't make sense, so...
This girl had no marks on her. She wasn't strangled. She wasn't beaten to death. What serial killer do you know leaves essentially an unmarked corpse on the side of the road without any physical damage being done to them?
I haven't heard of one, and that was going to be my ask to our listeners because I tried to find anybody that had something similar back in that time, or, at least at the very least, who was operating in that area, who left their victims on the side of the highway, but I could not find anyone that fit that bill. So
I don't even want to waste any brain power on that because I don't think it's at all possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's just too, out there with the potential for what the cause of death could have been. But I did want to say one really weird thing that I just thought you might find as strange as I did when I was researching this case. So back in February of 1998, it was a year prior to Mary's murder, a woman by the name of Joyce Dickerson, who also worked at Unicare Life and Health, the same company, the same location where Mary worked, had actually been killed by a serial killer in Springfield, Massachusetts. And it was such an odd coincidence. So of course, I'm like, oh my God, let me dive into this. Was this serial killer ever found? Could this be the one that they're talking about? But it was actually Alfred Gaynor, and he was arrested in April of 98. So there's no way that it could have been him involved, but it was just such a weird coincidence, the fact that same city and the same job, essentially.
Yeah, that is strange, and it makes you think, oh, wait, am I wrong in saying that I don't think it's possible that this was a serial killer?
Yeah.
But no, I mean, for me, I'm still sticking to the theory that this was an accidental death or something that wasn't planned. Somebody made a bad decision and they just wanted to get themselves as far removed as possible from what happened to her. So they ended up putting her on the side of the highway after whatever happened.
Yeah, I can see that.
It just seems like textbook to me. There's no marks on her. They never released a toxicology report. She was found nude. Could she have been doing drugs? Could she have been having sex with somebody? It just seems almost cut and dry in my mind, without more information to sway me another way.
Yeah.
That this was not a purposeful killing. This was somebody that was like, oh shit, I can't believe this happened. It was an accident, but I don't want to be involved in it, so I'm going to try and get rid of the body.
Yeah, that's where I land as well. Because there's really nothing else that makes sense.
Yes, and I could totally be swayed if more information was provided.
Agreed.
But with what we know now, and the condition of her body when she was found, how are you going to believe something else?
Exactly, yeah. So moving on to the questions that we're left with, the number one question that I have is, where's Mary's wallet and was it ever located? Because that, obviously, we know the clothing, but you never know what could have happened with that. Maybe someone felt as though their DNA could be on it, something like that. Did they also just scoop up her wallet and toss it?
Or burned it?
Or, yeah.
Get rid of it somehow?
Yeah, I just wonder, did somebody ever find it in a friend's car and they were like, oh, whose wallet is this? And,
no, I'm thinking that if this was an accident and this person was like, shit, I need to distance myself from this, and they disposed of her body off the side of the highway, and then they had all of her belongings, those are long gone. Those are probably burnt, torched,
or in
thrown
a
in a fire
somewhere. Yeah.
No. They're probably
gone.
Gone. You're never going to find them. They're destroyed.
Interesting you say that. You know what I was thinking too had to do with, if authorities were to ever release if there was a sexual assault or not, because I feel like with, your theory of this being an accident, I feel like you would not see a sexual assault in this instance. I feel like it would be, if anything, maybe consensual sex.
Right.
And
That's
then,
what I was thinking.
Yeah, and even if not, maybe if it was just a hangout where something happened.
Right. Or consensual sex, drugs involved, they fall asleep afterwards. One person wakes up and Mary never does.
But I don't, that's the other thing though, like it could be anything. I mean, she could have been accidentally drugged because I don't know if she did drugs.
Yeah.
And you know, that's just...
And this is still just surmising that if she had no physical marks on her, you would have to assume that she either died of some type of medical emergency or from something that she ingested, or like we had mentioned, you know, earlier on, could she have been smothered?
Yeah, but why else would authorities have ordered a toxicology?
Right.
They have to think that it's something she ingested for them to order that, is what I would think.
That's what I would think too.
Yeah.
Or because they didn't have enough information, they were like, hey, you can do this and it may provide us something else, so go do it. So coin flip on that one. But, I mean, I don't want to keep reiterating what I believe. I think everybody listening knows what I think happened just based on what we know.
Yep.
But
yeah, I'm on board with that.
Yeah, maybe Vermont State Police will release something in the coming week or weeks.
Yeah, if you guys are listening.
And maybe we'll find some more info.
We can only hope. There unfortunately is not much information out there about Mary's family, and the only details I've been able to find are that most of her family and friends left the Springfield area after her death. Regardless, Mary deserves justice. If you know anything about the last known whereabouts of Mary Morales before she was found deceased in March of 1999, or if you have any information regarding her death, please contact Captain Scott Dunlap with the Vermont State Police Major Crime Unit at 802-244-8781. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.